I arrived at Zara's engagement party feeling like an unwanted guest. Amy whispered, "Please behave today," and I forced a smile. Abba looked at me and said, "At least pretend you have a plan." I laughed weakly and replied, "I always have a plan." Inside I felt small. Hira, the host, greeted me. "You're Zara's brother, right?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes, the quiet one," I said. She laughed politely, but I could see curiosity in her eyes. Zara hugged me. "Please don't argue with Ryan," she said softly. I answered, "I'm only here for you." Music played loudly while relatives stared at me. One cousin whispered, "Still jobless?" I pretended not to hear. Ryan walked toward me with a confident grin. "So, Ayan," he said, "still searching for your purpose?" I replied calmly, "I'm working on something." He laughed and said, "Dreaming is not working." People nearby chuckled. Amy tried to change the subject. "Food is ready," she said. Ryan raised his glass and began giving a speech. "Success comes from action," he announced. "Not from sitting at home doing nothing." His eyes turned toward me. "Some people here should learn that." Laughter spread across the hall. My chest tightened. I said quietly, "You don't know my life." He stepped closer and said loudly, "Everyone knows you're jobless." Phones lifted. Cousins started recording. Someone shouted, "Say something, Ayan." I forced a smile and replied, "Congratulations on the engagement." Inside my thoughts screamed. I remembered late nights coding, Hamza bringing tea, and rejection emails flashing on my screen. Ryan kept talking. "Maybe you should ask me for a job," he joked. Zara looked uncomfortable. "Ryan, stop," she whispered. He ignored her. "Tell us, Ayan," he said, "what exactly do you do all day?" I answered, "I build things." He laughed louder. "Invisible things?" Abu sighed heavily. "Enough embarrassment," he muttered. I felt heat in my face. Hira tried to help. "Let's move on," she said into the microphone. Ryan continued, "No, this is inspiring. Anyone can avoid work and call it passion." More laughter. My hand shook. I said quietly, "You'll understand someday." He smirked. "I already understand failure." I walked toward Zara. "I'm proud of you," I told her. She looked at me with guilt. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Emmy touched my arm. "Ignore him," she said. I nodded, but my heart felt heavy. As I moved toward the exit, cousins whispered behind me. "He looked hurt," one said. "Maybe he cried," another joked. I stepped outside into the night air and took a deep breath. Hamza called me immediately. "Bro, I heard something happened," he said. I replied, "They laughed at me again." He answered, "Let your work answer them." I said, "I'm tired of hiding." He said, "Then stop hiding." I sat on a bench remembering every sacrifice I made for my secret startup. I whispered to myself, "Enough silence." At home, Abu said, "You embarrassed us." I replied calmly, "One day you will understand." Emmy looked worried. "Please think about your future," she said. I answered, "I am thinking about it every second." I went to my room, opened my laptop, and stared at my project. My hands stopped shaking. I said quietly, "No more hiding." I decided that night my work would finally speak for me. The next morning, Zara knocked on my door. "Can we talk?" she asked. I said, "Come in." She sat quietly and said, "Ryan went too far." I replied, "You didn't stop him." She looked down. I was scared of ruining the night. I answered, "My dignity was already ruined." She whispered, "I didn't know you were hurting this much." I said, "No one asked." She said, "What are you really working on?" I paused and replied, "Something that will change everything." She asked, "Why didn't you trust us?" I said, "Because you all stopped believing in me." She started crying. "I do believe in you," she said. I answered softly, "Then watch what happens next." Later, Amy brought tea. "Beta, your father is worried," she said. I replied, "He is worried about shame, not me." She said, "He loves you but doesn't understand you." I answered, "One day he will." My phone buzzed again. Hamza texted, "Meeting tonight. Investor ready." I smiled and whispered, "It's time." A bud stood at my door and said, "Prove me wrong." I looked at him and replied, "I will." I opened my notebook and reviewed my pitch while speaking to myself. "Stay calm," I said. "Tell the truth." Hamza called again and asked, "Ready to shock them?" I laughed softly and replied, "More ready than ever." I closed my eyes and remembered every insult, every laugh, every doubt. Then I stood up and said firmly, This is only the beginning. I will not fail. I walked alone through empty streets, replaying every laugh from the party. I muttered, jobless, useless, failure, and kicked a stone across the road. My phone rang. Bro, talk to me, Hamza said. I replied, they humiliated me again. He answered, you are not what they say. I sighed and said, it still hurts. He asked, did you forget the nights we built your project together? I said quietly, I remember every line of code. He laughed softly. Then remember why you started. I answered, because I lost everything when my old company fired me. He said, and you promised yourself you would never beg for approval again. I stopped walking and whispered, tonight I almost believed their words. He replied firmly, don't let one arrogant guy erase your progress. I sat on a bench and opened my laptop. The prototype still works, I told him. Hamza said, show it to the world. I replied, I'm scared they will laugh again. He answered, fear is temporary. Regret lasts forever. I closed my eyes and remembered rejection emails. I said, 30 investors said no. He laughed. 31 will say yes. I said, I almost deleted everything last month. He replied, but you didn't. I smiled weakly. Because you forced me to continue. He said, because I believe in you. My phone beeped with family messages. One cousin wrote, any update on your job hunt? Another said, maybe join Ryan's company as an assistant. I muttered, they only see failure. Hamza asked, are you reading the group chat again? I said, yes, and it burns. He replied, mute it and focus. I hesitated but finally muted the chat. Done? I said. He answered, good. Now listen carefully. Mrs. Sanaa wants to talk to you. My heart raced. Tonight? I asked. He replied, right now. A calm voice greeted me on the call. Ayan, I heard about the incident, Mrs. Sanaa said. I replied, it was humiliating. She answered, pain can become power if you use it wisely. I said, I want to prove myself but I don't want revenge to control me. She responded, then present your work at the Global Tech Summit. I froze. That is where Ryan's company will present, I said. She replied calmly, exactly. Let your work speak. I hesitated. What if I fail publicly? She said, failure is not silence. Silence is surrender. I breathed deeply and said, I need time to think. She answered, take tonight. Registration closes tomorrow morning. I walked toward home feeling torn. Abu called me from the living room. Stop dreaming and find a real job, he said. I replied quietly, I am building something real. He shook his head. Dreams do not feed families. I answered, give me one chance. He said, you already wasted enough chances. Emmy tried to calm us. Please don't fight, she said. I went to my room and closed the door. Hamza called again. What did she say? He asked. I replied, she wants me to present at the summit. He shouted, that's your moment. I said, I don't know if I'm ready. He answered, you were ready months ago. I stared at my screen filled with code. If I go there, I face Ryan again, I said. He replied, face your future instead. I thought about every insult, every sleepless night, every small victory hidden from my family. I whispered, I'm not doing this for revenge. He answered, then do it for yourself. I opened the registration page. My hands trembled. I said slowly, I'm signing up. He laughed with pride. I clicked submit and said firmly, this time my work will speak for me. After submitting, I paced around my room and spoke to myself. No more hiding, I said. Zara knocked lightly and asked, are you still upset? I replied, I'm focused now. She said, Ryan thinks you hate him. I answered, I don't hate anyone. I just refuse to stay small. She hesitated and said, I wish I understood your work. I opened my laptop and showed her a small demo. She whispered, you built this alone? I replied, with Hamza's help and many sleepless nights. She looked surprised and said, why didn't you tell us? I answered, because every time I tried, someone laughed. She said softly, I won't laugh again. My phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Sanaa. Confidence is quiet preparation. I repeated her words aloud. Zara asked, are you really going to that conference? I nodded and said, yes. Not to fight anyone but to finally be seen. She gave a small smile and said, then I hope they listen. I closed my laptop, took a deep breath and whispered, They will. I looked in the mirror and said, I survived humiliation. Tomorrow I begin again stronger. I woke early and told myself, today changes everything. Hamza called and said, nervous? I replied, terrified but ready. I dressed carefully and whispered, stay calm. On my way out, Abu said, don't embarrass us again. I answered, just watch me. Outside the venue my hands shook. I called Sir Imran. He said, quiet students surprise loud crowds. I replied, what if they laugh again? He answered, let your work speak louder than fear. I took a deep breath and walked inside. Cameras flashed everywhere. Zara waved nervously and said, please avoid drama. I answered, I'm here for business. Ryan approached with a smirk. Came to watch real success? He asked. I replied calmly, I came to learn. He laughed loudly. Learning requires talent. I said nothing and moved toward registration. The staff handed me a badge. Ryan glanced at it and said, guest access suits you. I smiled quietly and walked away. Backstage I met a serious man. You must be Ayan, he said. I nodded. Yes. He introduced himself. I'm Bilal, Ryan's partner. I replied carefully, nice to meet you. He whispered, not everything you see here is real. I frowned and asked, what do you mean? He said softly, just be ready for surprises. My heart raced. I checked my presentation file again. Zara came backstage and said, Ryan thinks you came to support him. I replied, let him think that. She asked, are you hiding something? I smiled and said, you'll see soon. She looked confused but left quietly. Hamza texted, you've got this. I replied, stay online. The host announced the opening ceremony. I watched business leaders greet each other. Investors shook hands while reporters moved around. I whispered to myself, focus on the work. Sir Imran sent a message, confidence is silent preparation. I repeated his words and felt calmer. Ryan took the stage first. Innovation belongs to the brave, he announced proudly. I listened from backstage while memories of the party echoed. I heard laughter again in my mind. I said quietly, not this time. Bilal stood beside me and whispered, watch closely. Ryan presented flashy slides and big promises. The audience clapped loudly. Zara smiled from the front row. I felt a wave of doubt. I said to Bilal, what if my work isn't enough? He replied, truth always lasts longer than noise. I opened my laptop and reviewed my demo. My fingers trembled. I called Hamza quickly. I feel sick, I said. He replied, fear means you care. I asked, what if they humiliate me again? He answered, then you stand taller. The host announced a short break. I walked to a quiet corner and practiced my opening line aloud. My name is Ayan, I said softly. Bilal returned and handed me water. Your turn is coming, he said. I nodded silently. Zara approached again and whispered, Ryan says his company will dominate today. I replied, we'll see. She asked, why are you so calm? I answered, because I finally believe in myself. She stared at me with surprise. The coordinator came backstage and said, presenters be ready. My heart pounded. I held my file tightly and said to myself, no fear. Hamza sent another message, remember every night you worked. I whispered, I remember. The lights dimmed as the next session prepared. I stood behind the curtain listening to applause fade. I closed my eyes and saw every rejection email turning into motivation. I opened them again and smiled quietly. Smiles before storms, I said to myself. The host's voice echoed, next speaker coming soon. I stepped forward slightly, waiting for my name, breathing slowly, ready. I looked at Bilal and asked, why warn me earlier? He replied, because honesty deserves a chance. I said, Ryan seems confident. Bilal sighed and said, confidence can hide cracks. I felt tension growing. A reporter approached me and asked, are you presenting today? I smiled and said, you'll find out soon. She laughed and walked away. Sir Imran called suddenly. Where are you standing? He asked. I replied, behind the curtain. He said, stand straight and breathe slowly. I followed his advice and felt steadier. Zara sent a message, I hope you're okay. I answered, better than ever. Ryan walked backstage briefly and said, enjoy the free snacks, guest. I replied quietly, enjoy your spotlight while it lasts. He laughed and left. Bilal leaned closer and whispered, truth reveals itself under bright lights. I nodded and reviewed my opening slide again. The coordinator said, 2 speakers before you. I counted my breaths. Hamza sent a voice note, proud of you already. I replied softly, thank you for never giving up on me. I watched another presenter struggle with questions and felt my anxiety rise again. I said to myself, stay focused on solutions. The crowd noise faded into a distant hum. I tightened my grip on the presentation file and whispered, this is my moment to be heard. I checked the stage lights glowing ahead and told myself, walk forward with honesty, speak clearly, and let every past insult become silent strength today. I stood behind the curtain when the host said, our next keynote speaker is Ayan. My heart pounded as whispers spread. I walked onto the stage and heard shocked gasps. Zara covered her mouth and Abu stared at me in disbelief. Ryan laughed loudly and said, this must be a mistake. I took a deep breath and said into the microphone, hello, my name is Ayan, and today I will show you what quiet work looks like. The room fell silent. I continued, months ago I lost everything but I kept building. A judge asked, what problem are you solving? I replied, I am solving real business inefficiency with simple technology. I showed my first slide and explained my system. Investors leaned forward. One asked, did you build this alone? I answered, with support from my friend Hamza and guidance from my mentor. Ryan interrupted from the audience, nice animation. I smiled and said, please wait until the live demo. I ran the software and the screen filled with real data. The audience murmured with surprise. A judge said, this is faster than current market tools. I replied, because I designed it after facing failure myself. Another investor asked, how scalable is your model? I answered confidently, it grows with demand without raising costs. I noticed Zara watching me with tears. I continued explaining features through direct questions. A reporter asked, why stay silent until today? I replied, because sometimes work needs time before it speaks. Applause began slowly. I moved to the final slide and said, innovation is not loud promises but honest solutions. The judges nodded. Suddenly Bilal walked toward the microphone and said, I need to add something important. I looked at him in confusion. He continued, parts of Ryan's earlier presentation were copied from drafts originally shared by Ayan months ago. The crowd gasped loudly. Ryan stood up and said, that is a lie. Bilal replied calmly, I have emails and timestamps. Investors began murmuring. One judge turned to Ryan and asked, can you explain this claim? Ryan laughed nervously and said, ideas are similar everywhere. I stayed quiet and said into the microphone, my focus is my work, not arguments. Another investor asked me, did you submit these drafts earlier? I answered, yes, and they were rejected before I improved them. Bilal displayed documents on the big screen showing matching code sections. The room filled with shocked whispers. Zara looked devastated and whispered from her seat, I didn't know. Ryan's smile faded. A judge said to him, we need clarification immediately. He tried to joke, competition inspires everyone. Investors responded with serious questions. One said, integrity matters more than confidence. I continued answering technical questions calmly. A senior investor said to me, your composure is impressive. I replied, I learned patience through failure. The applause grew louder after every answer. Ryan attempted to interrupt again but the host said, please allow the speaker to finish. I concluded my presentation by saying, I stand here not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove that persistence works. The audience stood up and clapped. I felt my hands finally stop shaking. Judges gathered near the stage and asked more questions. One said, what inspired you to keep going after humiliation? I answered honestly, pain pushed me forward but purpose kept me steady. Zara approached the stage and whispered, I'm proud of you. I replied softly, thank you for listening. Abu stood silently with mixed emotions. Reporters asked me for quick interviews while investors exchanged business cards. Meanwhile I heard heated conversations around Ryan. Someone said, we need a formal investigation. I focused on answering honest questions about my work instead of looking at him. Bilal shook my hand and said, truth needed a voice today. I replied, thank you for your courage. The host returned to the microphone and said, innovation requires honesty. I stepped down from the stage feeling lighter. Hamza called immediately and shouted, you just changed everything. I laughed softly and said, minutes ago they laughed at me. He replied, now they respect you. I looked around and saw the same faces watching me with admiration instead of mockery. I whispered to myself, no one is laughing now. Investors continued asking rapid questions. One asked, how soon can this launch publicly? I replied, within 3 months if partnerships align. Another said, what support do you need right now? I answered, honest collaboration and transparent feedback. A young developer in the crowd shouted, your journey gives me hope. I smiled and said, keep building even when nobody truly claps. Zara wiped her tears and said softly, I should have defended you earlier. I replied, growth matters more than regret. Abu stepped closer and whispered, I misjudged your silence. I answered, I only wanted one chance. A journalist asked, what message do you have for people called failures? I said firmly, failure is a lesson, not identity. The judges thanked me again and said, your work shows discipline and resilience. I bowed my head and said, I'm grateful for every tough moment that brought me here today. I left the conference hall while reporters surrounded me. Ayan, how does it feel to go from jobless to innovator? One asked. I replied, I never felt jobless, only unseen. Another reporter said, your calm response during controversy impressed many. I answered, I focused on solutions, not noise. Investors approached quickly. One said, we want to fund your project immediately. I replied, I value long-term partners, not rushed deals. Another investor asked, what is your vision now? I said, to build honest technology that solves real problems. Hamza called and shouted, bro, your clips are everywhere. I laughed softly and said, I just wanted respect. He replied, you earned it. I sat in a quiet room for my first media interview. The host asked, did public humiliation motivate you? I answered, pain pushed me but purpose guided me. She asked, do you feel revenge? I paused and said, I feel relief more than revenge. My phone buzzed with messages from relatives suddenly calling me talented. I whispered to myself, strange how success changes voices. Zara entered the room slowly and said, can we talk privately? I nodded. We sat alone. She said, I watched the videos again and cried. I replied, I never wanted to hurt you. She said, I should have defended you that night. I answered, we all learn through mistakes. She looked down and said, Ryan is facing serious questions now. I felt conflicted and said, I did not expose him personally. She whispered, but truth did. I nodded quietly. She asked, do you hate him? I replied, I hate arrogance, not people. She hugged me and said, I'm proud of you. I felt my anger soften. At home, Abu sat silently. He said, I watched your speech many times. I replied, I only wanted one chance. He said, I doubted you because I feared failure. I answered, fear pushed me too. Amy brought tea and said, our home feels different now. I replied, success should not change love. Abu whispered, I am sorry. I said softly, thank you for saying that. We sat together quietly for the first time without tension. My phone showed 2 videos side by side. One showed people laughing at me during the engagement. The other showed applause from the conference. I whispered, time rewrites stories. Hamza messaged, choose growth, not revenge. I typed back, I'm trying. Another alert appeared showing news about investigations into Ryan's company finances. I felt uneasy and said aloud, I never wanted someone's total collapse. Mrs. Sana called and said, success tests your character. I replied, I want to stay grounded. She answered, then focus on your work. Later, reporters announced that Ryan wanted to issue a public apology. I watched the broadcast. He said, I respect Ayan's work, but his tone sounded forced. A journalist asked him, did you copy ideas? He replied defensively, business is competitive. I sighed and said, he still does not understand. Zara called me crying. Everything is falling apart for him, she said. I answered, truth hurts, but growth is possible. She asked, will you expose more details? I paused and said, I only want to move forward. That night, I walked alone on the rooftop thinking about revenge and forgiveness. I said to myself, victory without peace feels empty. Hamza called again and asked, are you happy? I replied, I feel complicated. He laughed and said, that means you are human. I watched city lights and remembered every insult turning into motivation. I decided to focus on building my future instead of destroying someone else's past. I whispered, respect is enough. The next morning I met investors again. One said, your honesty attracts trust. I replied, Honesty saved me. Another asked, "Are you ready for rapid growth?" I answered, "Only if values stay strong." Zara joined me and said quietly, "I want to support your journey." I smiled and said, "Walk beside me, not behind anyone else." She nodded with tears. Abu later texted me, "Proud of you, son." I read it twice and felt emotional. I told myself, this is the real victory. I closed my laptop, looked at my reflection and said firmly, I choose growth over revenge. Later that evening, Bilal called me and said, "Investigators want statements from everyone involved." I replied, "I will only speak truthfully." He answered, "That is enough." I asked him, "Do you regret exposing everything?" He said, "Silence protects lies." I respected his honesty but felt heavy inside. Soon after, Sir Imran messaged me, "Fame is louder than wisdom, stay humble." I replied, "I am trying to stay the same person." He said, "Remember the student who feared laughter, keep that humility." I laughed softly and answered, "I will never forget those days." Later, Hira sent a message saying, "People now quote your speech online." I replied, "I hope they focus on hard work, not drama." As I prepared to sleep, Amy knocked and said, "Your journey inspires neighbors." I smiled and replied, "I only wanted peace." I closed my eyes and whispered, "Tomorrow I build again." I slept with calm. I stared at the contract and whispered, "Is this real?" My manager laughed softly. "It's real. A major investment. You earned it." I sighed. "Why do I feel scared instead of happy?" He asked, "What scares you?" I answered, "Success feels like distance. I don't want to lose my family again." He said, "Talk to them. Don't guess their hearts." At dinner, I said, "I got an investment offer today." My mother smiled. "That's wonderful." I hesitated. "What if success changes me?" She replied, "Pain already changed you. Success might just heal you." Zara walked in quietly and said, "Can we talk alone?" I nodded and followed her outside. She said, "I owe you an apology." I crossed my arms. "Why now?" She whispered, "I followed appearances instead of loyalty. I chose comfort over truth." I asked, "Do you regret it?" She answered, "Every day. I saw your silence and called it weakness. I was wrong." I said, "Your words hurt more than the betrayal." She nodded. "I know. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I see your strength now." I took a deep breath. "I'm still healing. But I don't want to carry hate forever." She whispered, "Thank you for even listening." Later that night, my father called me into his study. He said quietly, "Sit down." I asked, "Is something wrong?" He looked at me and said, "I watched everything you went through." I stayed silent. He continued, "I didn't speak because I wanted to see if you would stand on your own." I said softly, "I needed your words." He nodded slowly. "I know. And I'm sorry." I felt my chest tighten. "Why call me now?" He looked directly into my eyes and said, "Because I'm proud of you." I froze. "You've never said that before." He replied, "You didn't chase revenge. You built something honest. That takes real strength." I whispered, "I just wanted peace." He said, "And you earned respect instead." The next day, a reporter asked me, "Have you seen the news about Ryan?" I answered, "No." She said, "He's facing lawsuits and public backlash." I felt no joy, only quiet reflection. "I hope he learns from it." She asked, "No revenge?" I replied, "Growth is enough." A week later, Ryan requested to meet me. I arrived at the cafe and said, "You wanted to talk?" He looked tired. "I expected you to mock me." I shook my head. "That wouldn't change anything." He sighed. "I lost everything." I said calmly, "You made choices." He whispered, "Do you hate me?" I thought for a moment. I hated the pain. But I don't want to live with anger forever. He looked confused. "You're not here to humiliate me?" I replied, "No. I'm here for closure." He asked, "How did you stay calm?" I said, "Silence gave me time to grow." He nodded slowly. "You became stronger without fighting back." I answered, "Strength isn't always loud." When I returned home, my manager asked, "Did you decide about the investment?" I smiled. "Yes." He leaned forward. "And?" I said confidently, "I'm accepting it. But my family stays my priority." He laughed. "That sounds like balance." Weeks later, I stood backstage at a school event. An organizer said, "These students look up to you." I whispered, I used to be the one they laughed at. She smiled. Now they're waiting to hear your story. I walked onto the stage and said into the microphone, I used to think silence meant losing. A student asked, what changed your mind? I replied, pain taught me patience. Another student said, did people really laugh at you? I nodded. Yes. And their laughter pushed me to grow instead of break. Someone asked, did you want revenge? I answered, many times. But revenge would have chained me to the past. Another voice asked, so what is real strength? I said, choosing dignity when anger feels easier. The hall became quiet. I continued, success is not about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself honest. A student asked, were you ever lonely? I replied, very. But loneliness became space for self-respect. Another student said, what should we do when people doubt us? I answered, listen to your own growth more than their noise. I looked around and recognized faces that once mocked me. One of them stood up and said, we misjudged you. I smiled gently. We all grow. The applause filled the room, but inside I felt something deeper, peace. I realized my victory was not their applause or my success. My victory was becoming someone who could forgive, rebuild, and stand tall without losing kindness. Sir, a student whispered, were you ever afraid you'd fail forever? I smiled gently. Every day, I said. Fear sat beside me like a shadow, but I kept walking anyway. Another student asked, what changed you? I answered, I stopped trying to prove others wrong and started proving myself honest. The hall stayed quiet, absorbing each honest word, lesson, memory, scar, victory, breath, step, promise, truth, forward.
If this story stayed with you, subscribe now for the next powerful story.